Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call to order the committee meetings of the Bellingham City Council. We have several committee meetings this morning. The first one up is the Public Works and Public Safety Committee, and the chair for that is Member Terry Borneman.
Thank you, Michael. Joining me on the committee is Roxanne Murphy and Jean Knutson. We have two items before the committee today. The first one is a proposal to remove on-street parking from Orleans and Woburn Street.
Thank you. Ted Carlson, Public Works Department. This is the work session item, which is the carryover from the public hearing that was held at your last City Council meeting. As is our practice, anytime parking is removed from arterial streets, we go to council and request council to take action on that. The two projects before the council that were discussed in the public hearing are related to the bicycle master plan and have to do with installation of bike lanes on a portion of Orleans and a portion of Woburn. And we had the public hearing where Chris Como, transportation planner, went through really the origin of the projects. They came out of the bicycle master plan. Really does have to do with providing connectivity and options for bicyclists in this portion of the city of Bellingham. We are working on bicycle boulevards on the non-arterial streets and utilizing the recently installed crossings on Alabama to get people across Alabama as part of the bicycle boulevards. These particular projects are bike lanes on the arterials, which is our practice on arterial streets, utilizing the signals, traffic signals, to get people across Alabama and onto where they're going. We did have a couple comments at the public hearing, and so council asked to bring the item forward to a work session for further discussion. I also received a couple questions from Councilmember Knutson related to these projects, and I can go through those quickly. And then, as you can see, Chris did load up the PowerPoint that we presented at the council meeting or the public hearing, and we're happy to go through that and go through any additional questions that council might have today. So Jean's questions had to do with Orleans, and so we're talking about the section of Orleans north from Alabama to almost Barkley. There's some sections of Barkley up, sections of Orleans up to Barkley where it's already posted no parking because there's no width and there's turn lanes and things of that nature. But talking about everywhere where there currently is on-street parking on that section of Orleans, staff went out and did parking surveys for both of these streets, both Orleans and Woburn. As I mentioned, bicycle lanes were identified in the bike master plan, and there simply isn't enough room between the curbs to fit the traveled lanes, on-street parking, and bicycle lanes in both directions. And so what that comes down to is needing to remove parking from one side of the street to allow bike boulevards on, or bicycle lanes on both sides of Orleans and Woburn. So as I mentioned, the traffic studies were conducted, and we did them over about a month period, 3 different days throughout the week, both morning counts and evening counts. What we found is that parking utilization on both sides of the streets, and I'll talk specifically about Orleans here, are low, relatively speaking. But what we did find is that one side was quite a bit lower than the other. And when I say parking utilization, meaning the number of people that are actually parking on street. And what we found is that there's very low parking on the west side of Orleans. The utilization there, meaning the percentage of parking, I believe it was around 4%. So there wasn't very many people parking on the west side. About 9% utilization on the east side. So just looking at the two, it made sense. We simply went with the side of the street that had the lower number of people parking on it, knowing that if we did move forward with the no parking, they could certainly park on the other side of Orleans, and given that that was only parked out at about 9%, certainly it seems as though there will be adequate parking availability, although they'll have to cross the street. And during the public hearing, we had a woman that lives on the corner of Orleans and East North Street who runs a business out of her home. She expressed concerns about losing 2 parking spaces adjacent to her property on Orleans, talked about her customers and that would be an impact to them. So Jean's question to me was, is there a way to keep the parking on the west side? And really what it comes down to is we would just need to flop it over and remove parking on the east side. So we really have to do all one or the other. We can't kind of go no parking on the east side throughout a section and then no parking on the west side. So certainly could do that, could flip the no parking over to the east side. have that whole section of Orleans be no parking, and that would allow the spaces to remain adjacent to the beauty salon on Orleans. It's just a matter of which side do we want to go, and as I said, we just simply recommended the side that had the lower utilization. A lot of that has to do with just how people are using the parking, the number of residents versus businesses and things of that nature. And we have some more information that we can go over in terms of how we conducted those surveys and what exactly we found. The one thing I would say is, as we talked about at the public hearing, we did put out notification to property owners and residents along sections of both Orleans and Woburn. And when we did that, we said that we would be considering removing parking on the west side. So I think if there was a decision to go and revisit that and perhaps look at should we remove parking on the east side, we would probably want to go back out and notify the residents, because it could be people that saw, oh, that's going to be on the west side, just didn't participate in the public hearing and go into the Transportation Commission. So the only other thing I would add, I just remind council that at that particular location where the concerns were expressed, they are on a corner lot, so there is parking on east-north. It may not be as convenient as certainly what the property owner suggested, but that is available to them. So they would have parking on both the opposite side of Orleans and adjacent to their property on north. So that was one question that Gene had, and I'm happy to discuss that in more detail.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, because I was going to ask the same question today. Because one of the things we had heard from the owner was that a big part of her clientele are older people. And a few years ago, I wouldn't have thought anything about when they say, oh, you can just park around the corner. But having gone through some major problems with my leg where I've had very limited ability for a while to be able to walk any distance without pain, I realized, what doesn't seem like a very much of a distance to many of us, if we're, our legs are sound, our body's sound, what's an extra block? But when problems start happening and part of your business is centered around older people, that does become an issue, I think. And so I would be inclined, I guess my question that relates to that about, because one, I think I would be in favor of swapping it out if it's not going to affect a business or something on the other side. And that is the question, is there businesses on the other side or something that way?
Yeah, and I think what we would want to do is explore that a little bit, and Chris may know the breakdown of residential versus the businesses that might be on the east side throughout that section of Orleans. But I do believe if the direction is to pursue no parking on the east side, that we would want to reach back out to the people that are located in that corridor to see perhaps folks that didn't engage in the process because they didn't think it was impacting adjacent to them would have some concerns. So we could certainly do that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Roxanne.
Well, I'd just like to provide a cycling perspective. When the weather turns better, frequently ride my bike to work, and that is in Everson. And so coming from Sunnyland, it is incredibly challenging because the hardest part of that ride is not the Mount Baker Highway, as people would assume. It's actually just trying to get out of town, because Orleans is really tough to get through on your bike safely because you're always looking over your shoulder. Woburn's even worse. So I'm not trying to disrespect the business that's located there, but we really need bicycle safety on two of these streets, especially because some people need to get to more affordable grocery at Safeway and they may only have a bike. So it would be nice if there were a clearer path for people to get to those amenities that are in Sunset or anywhere else along that area. So I'm generally supportive of this, but I definitely want to work with the neighborhoods in relation.
Gene.
Yeah, I'd just go ahead and move that we send this back and you do that survey on the other side of the street and see what we come up with. I mean, if it comes down to worst case scenario, isn't there a way to leave those parking spaces there and run bike lanes along the parking spaces like you've done in some other parts of the city?
I think the issue is we just don't have the width.
The width.
And so to leave leave any on
Yeah.
on that side. I know on Cornwall, and that may be one of the ones
Yeah,
that you're
that's what I'm
remembering.
talking about.
On Cornwall, we actually did a little bit of a modification to the curb line there and in front of the one business closer down to the high school to allow some parking pockets there. And I don't know about right-of-way width and things of that nature. So, but we could go back out, contact the neighborhood, see what we hear about the other side of the street. And so then the question would be do we do the same thing on Woburn, as we did hear the one gentleman on Woburn, although Chris might remind me here, which side did he live on?
Good afternoon, Council. The person who showed up at the public hearing actually lived on the opposite side of the street
Okay.
that we were going to take the parking off of.
Okay.
Yeah. Michael, you had your hand up?
Yeah, thank you. So I agree with what Roxanne said. This is a really good project, and I want to find a way to make it go forward. I have two questions, one small one. With regard to the beauty salon, I'm not sure where the front door, so to speak, of the beauty salon is. Is it sort of in the back, or is there a way to get to it from East North Street? Is there a good kind of ADA type walking path that could go from east north?
Yeah, I think we have some photos here that are. Chris
Yeah, I
will
have
pull
this
up.
Google image, but it's not the greatest resolution.
If everybody wants to look up the slide, the front door is essentially right here.
And the clients go in the front door?
These are the two
Yeah.
parking spaces in question, and clients would then enter here and go down a little walkway that's just right here.
Yeah.
Okay. And then my other question had to do with the modifications. You say we don't have that much right-of-way to make kind of like we do for buses, kind of a pull-out, where the parking would be pushed a little further in. If the private property owner was, willing to have the right-of-way move in a couple more feet, could we actually accommodate parking and bike lane?
Yeah, I think that's a question we'd have to look into in a little more detail to look at things like right-of-way and utility conflicts and certainly it's straight there and there's good sight distance, but we also want to check folks pulling out into traffic at certain locations. So I think it just requires more analysis, and we can look at that and see what it would take.
Yeah. So, yeah, I fully understand what you're saying about the bicycle safety part. One of the reasons I've got the leg problem is because I was hit by a car riding my bike a long time ago, and I've had problems for years with it. So I understand that, but I also do understand, one, if we can accommodate a business and still come up with bicycle safety, I would prefer that we be able to do that. I mean, small business is our backbone here, and we need to look at that if we can. So, do I hear a motion?
Yeah, I move that we send this back
Okay.
to staff to look at alternatives.
Okay. Any other comments regarding that? Okay. Hearing none.
Before we vote,
Yeah.
I want to say thank you for your flexibility.
Right.
I know, when we pass a master plan, all these projects are in there. I know it, but a lot of times the public doesn't know it, they don't follow it. So it's always
Right.
great to come here, and they think it's a done deal. Can I say anything? So I just want to thank everybody for their flexibility.
Yes. Yep. Okay. All those in favor of the motion, answer aye.
Aye.
Okay. We will recommend that. Well, do we need to vote on it as the committee of the whole tonight, or
Yeah. I don't know.
this committee?
I don't
sending
think
it-
so. I mean, there wasn't a resolution in front of the council. I defer to Matt.
Matt, legal. I think it probably would be appropriate to actually
Okay.
vote on it tonight,
Okay.
committee of the whole, the way it's on the agenda packet.
Okay.
And I just wasn't clear, maybe
Yeah.
Ted was, is the direction on both Orleans and Woburn, or is it just on the
Nope.
one?
I think it's just on Orleans.
One.
Yep.
Yep. And so,
Vote tonight.
so do we need to make a decision on the other now? Or do you want to
Well, we're going to do both projects together.
Okay.
I mean, you can take a vote today on the
Yeah.
other one. I think that there's nothing in your
Yeah.
packet, so we don't need to amend a resolution or anything. So if there's a
Okay.
motion to move forward with putting no parking signs in on the west side of
Right.
of Orleans, I'm sorry, of Woburn, that could happen now.
Okay. That's okay, Roxanne? Yep, okay. All right. So our next item is a resolution changing McKenzie to one-way westbound between 9th and 8th Street in Fairhaven.
Thank you. Again, Ted Carlson, Public Works Department, along with Eric Johnston, Assistant Public Works Director. The resolution in the council's packet is, as Terry mentioned, to convert McKenzie between 9th Street and 8th to one-way westbound. Currently, that's a two-way section of McKenzie. And we can walk a little bit through why we came to that decision, working with the adjacent property owners and developer in that area. You may recall a while back, council passed a similar resolution to make 8th one-way northbound from McKenzie to Harris. And that was done in conjunction with both the development adjacent as well as stormwater facility that the city of Bellingham put in to treat about 90 acres of previously untreated stormwater runoff in the Fairhaven core. And at that time, that was one way, not restricted to emergency vehicles or anything, just one-way traffic, primarily serving the tennis club, because that McKenzie dead ends essentially into 8th. And at the time, we decided to pursue the one-way with an attempt to limit encroachment into the riparian area between 8th and Patton Creek, limit the amount of impervious surface. So we're trying to limit the amount of pavement that's being put down, and ensuring that all of the runoff possible goes into the newly built stormwater facility. So all of those factors were taken into consideration at the time that staff came forward and recommended 8th be converted to one-way. As the development progressed, the adjacent development between 8th and 9th and Harris and McKenzie progressed, and we were considering both that development and the existing situation on McKenzie in front of the tennis club. All the parties got together and tried to come up with a plan to make that function as efficiently as possible, kind of keeping some of the goals in mind that were identified. I think in the agenda bill does a good job of identifying all the different things that we're trying to juggle and consider in a fairly tight space there to try to make that area function as efficiently and safely as possible, trying to balance pedestrian needs there in terms of sidewalks and amenities, maximizing on-street parking, and we have policy direction for all of this, either through the comprehensive plan, and certainly the transportation element of the comp plan, and all of our sub-plans like the pedestrian plan, certainly prioritizing connectivity and pedestrian safety, maximizing on-street parking. As you recall, the urban village plan and neighborhood plan led us to the Fairhaven Parking Task Force, and one of the principles and policies that came out of that was we need to maximize parking availability in the Fairhaven core, understanding that it's an issue both for public and private parking. And then, as I mentioned, there's a close proximity to Patton Creek and the Patton estuary, and the city spent a lot of time and resources improving Patton Creek. Certainly had the daylighting project upstream. We had the improvements at the estuary. So trying to protect those critical areas and habitat was also certainly a priority, in making sure that the area functions from a emergency service access. We want to make sure that circulation moves through there, and obviously minimizing the conflict points. And anytime you go to one way, you're going to minimize some of the potential conflicts when you talk about pedestrian crossings and traffic, one-way traffic versus two-way traffic. So all of those things trying to fit into a pretty constrained area, and also recognizing the benefits of infill development and the fact that there's a development occurring right there that's going to provide some units in that portion of town. So collaborative effort coming together with what's before the council today, recommending converting McKenzie to one-way. We simply don't have room within the existing McKenzie right-of-way and the constrained area to accommodate parking on both sides of McKenzie, as well as the pedestrian improvements and two-way traffic. By converting it to one-way traffic, that would allow there to be parking on both sides of McKenzie. It'd be angled-in parking to accommodate the one-way flow. Would allow for the next phase of the development there. They're not required to do this during phase 1 that's being built right now. But during phase 2, they would be required to do frontage improvements along McKenzie, including sidewalk and parking. And would provide for the opportunity in the future for the private property owner on the south side, the tennis club, to build sidewalk where no sidewalk currently exists while maintaining angled-in front angled-in parking. So it does try to solve a lot of issues there. Eliminates the need for a hammerhead or a turnaround at the west end of McKenzie, because we wouldn't be having two-way traffic, people needing to turn around to access parking. They would simply continue out 8th on the one-way northbound on 8th back to Harris. So there have been several meetings with the neighborhood and traffic and Eric, who serves as our city traffic engineer, along with Chad Scholhauser, the city engineer, representatives from planning. I've met with neighborhood representatives down there walking through the project, and certainly there are concerns, and I know council has been contacted by the neighbors, and there's been some correspondence, and we're happy to answer any questions that council may have about the proposal. I will say, also contained in your agenda today under the consent agenda is an item requesting the ability to set a hearing with the public, or with the hearing examiner, for a public hearing to deal with a vacation request from the tennis club. So the owners of the tennis club have requested the city vacate a portion of right-of-way. That would have to have a hearing in front of the hearing examiner. There's certainly action and opportunity for public comment. The reason for that request is currently there's issues with right-of-way and private property and the parking along the tennis club. There's not the ability to allow that angled-in parking without having some of the parking being on private property, some of the parking being within the right-of-way. What the property owner is requesting is to vacate the right-of-way. All of the angled-in parking on the south side, the tennis club side, would be private parking for the tennis club. The city would retain some mechanism to allow public pedestrian access between the parking and the building where there currently is no sidewalk. And that would allow parking on both sides, both private and public, private on the south side, public on the north side. Would allow, when the sidewalk's constructed between the angled-in parking adjacent to the tennis club and the building, it would eliminate that need for now people walk behind the cars, because there is no sidewalk between the parking where people are parking in the building, so it eliminates some of the potential pedestrian vehicle conflicts there. So that's why that item is in your consent agenda. It's simply setting the hearing, the ability to set the hearing. There's not a decision on that, but I did want to highlight that because they are related items, but separate actions, and not necessarily requiring one or both to go forward for there to be a need for a decision. So I can pull up the area in question in City IQ if there's some questions about what we're talking about, and then we have a bit of a plan that we could put up there, and Eric can help walk through some of those issues if there are questions about that. And again, so what's before the council is a resolution to change the street from two-way to one-way. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
One, is this time sensitive for any?
I think there's certainly time to have a good discussion about it. So if it was council's desire to delay, perhaps to the next meeting, we're certainly, I think that makes a lot of sense. We understand that there's questions from the neighborhood. I'm not sure what additional information city staff can provide, but we're certainly here to answer any questions that might come up that haven't been answered. So to answer your question, I think it's fine if council wants to have a bigger, broader discussion about it. Yep.
I know that was one of the big things we kept hearing, asking if it's possible to delay it till the next meeting so they could get more information about it and ask questions. And so, committee? Yep, Roxanne.
I just feel that change is difficult, and especially street changes are difficult, so I'm going to move that we would delay this until the next meeting to do better community outreach, get some understanding, and help people see, the pros and cons of this.
Gene?
Yeah, I agree. This project goes way back, not just to 2015 when the agreement, all that, there's a lot of history in this, so any more communication, any more sitting down with people and letting them know what's going on is a good thing.
And I agree as well. So, we have a, Michael?
Yeah, I have a couple questions. I'm wondering, it would be nice to understand, I've heard a number of points of view on this, and I'd like to hear the third point of view on it. Has to do with how much of this is driven by fire access issues and the need for a large turnaround for a truck, or, as you say, a hammerhead turnaround for a truck. How much of it is driven by the fire access issues, and how much is driven by ordinary traffic issues?
Those are great, excuse me, those are great questions, and if I can try to answer that question without going through a sketch here. As Ted pointed out, we're trying to find the best, or a balance for a number of different competing factors. And what we, in coming to this recommendation, chose to place a much greater priority on pedestrian amenities, sidewalks, and the number of parking spaces available over other concerns. So in the agenda bill, it talks about emergency vehicle access. One of the primary concerns for that is where does the, and Steve Sundin can help me with this if I get this wrong, but where does the fire truck go if it needs to come be on site and fight a fire at those buildings? And so the space on Mackenzie, that clear 26 feet of space that we would provide for, is intended for the fire lane or the fire access, not so much for the fire truck to turn around. If we want to maximize the amount of parking, then that calls for some degree of angle parking. We haven't figured out if it's 45 or 60 or 75 degrees, but having the parking angling the same direction, pointed to the east, then cars going on a one-way street can pull into those parking spaces legally. If we have the two-way street, then we need to accommodate for cars to turn around, and that's probably best accomplished not as opposed to a hammerhead, which is intended for the occasional use, but a full circular turnaround to allow us the cars to head west, turn around in an easy, controlled motion, and then head eastbound and then head into those angle parking spaces, or to consider that to be a back-in parking heading eastbound. Other options could be to eliminate angle parking and reduce the number of parking spaces and use parallel parking spaces. However, that seems to conflict with two larger priorities of sidewalks and the amount of parking. So what we are making a recommendation on is to place traffic circulation at a much lower level than those other priorities. So the ability for emergency vehicles to go through and get from point A to point B is provided for whether it's a one-way or a two-way street. The width of that space between the parking spaces on Mackenzie is allowed for those fire vehicles to come, set themselves up, be able to work and operate efficiently and safely for that.
One of the other things I want to talk about is Mackenzie has an unusual history. It used to be the widest right-of-way in Fairhaven. Dirty Dan thought that would be the big promenade. He made it 100 feet wide. At that section, for various reasons over history, it's now down to 60 feet, which is even less than many of the other rights-of-way. And I guess I'm concerned with the other item that has to do with the street vacation. Would that make it even more narrow? And it also is kind of a move in an unusual direction to create private parking amenity in the middle of Fairhaven. I don't know anything that in the parking task force that talked about increasing private parking. I thought it was just increased parking, and I assumed that meant public parking. Is there another way to create more parking that isn't private parking? And that relates to the width of the street and the potential vacation.
I think that's worth something worth looking into. The right-of-way vacation, the majority of that is on the opposite, either end, the east and west end of that property. So there's some oddities that were created on the other side. So you have this kind of a dog bone looking piece of property. And there are, within the existing right-of-way right now, the way the parking is in front of the tennis club, a portion of that is on private property and a very small portion is on public property. This concept would continue that, and it would help us to do the vacation, clears up the two ends, but also would clarify that small section in the middle where you'd have an overlap of the parking stalls extending out into public space. So I'm not sure we can, it's not a very clean answer, I think. It's a complicated section of right-of-way for sure.
So just like 15 minutes ago on the Orleans Street thing, I was suggesting that we get creative and potentially, allow for a parking amenity which might actually straddle the private-public boundary. That made me more comfortable in the idea of going the other direction, which is to make it all private, can't we, I mean, I understand about the weird little dog legs at the far east and west end of that stretch of road, but why narrow the middle portion? Can't we just use the same creative idea that we currently have, which is it's public parking, but there's some sort of agreement or understanding that the nose half sticks over onto private property outside of the right-of-way?
It's currently private parking.
Now it's currently all
It's
on
currently
private.
private parking. And I think there's opportunities to talk about those things. I think that our current mindset is that we would prefer it to be one or the other, either entirely private or entirely public, and to deal with the mechanics that come out of that at some future point. But it's worth talking about for sure.
And then one more question. So the history with 8th Street is that there was an agreement reached with the neighborhood to actually close off 8th Street. And it had to do with the neighborhood's concern with the fact that I think all, or at least a lot of 8th Street is actually within the 100 feet buffer recommended, and all of it definitely is within the 200 feet of shoreline. So the goal was to close off 8th Street, have the emergency vehicle access only. That plan has now been backed away from. Now it's just one way only. But it's one way only with very low traffic. If this Mackenzie Street were to be changed, and with the significant new development, and maybe and the current tennis club traffic, and maybe future traffic if it's redeveloped, it may only be one way on 8th Street, but it'll be a lot more traffic. So what can we say about the impact of greater traffic on 8th Street, even if the right-of-way, even if the lane width isn't increased? What are the impacts in terms of hydrocarbons onto the street, in terms of noise, in terms of light? Are there greater, there must be some kind of greater impacts. What are they with now the doubling or tripling the traffic on that little leg?
Well, certainly with the development that's occurring right there, there's going to be additional trips in that area. I will say that both the phase 1, which is underway right now, I think is maybe 9 units, and then the future phase 2 development as proposed would bring the total units up to around 50 or so. When you look at that, the total PM peak trips that would come off that development are not large enough to warrant, through our code, a traffic impact analysis. And so a detailed traffic impact analysis hasn't been done because the project, at least as you look at it as it relates to our code and a typical development that would trigger traffic impact analysis, would need to have 50 PM peak trips or greater. This would be around 20 PM peak trips at full build out. And so certainly more traffic than is there now, but certainly not a tremendous amount of traffic when you think of it in a core urban area.
Let me re-clarify. I'm not worried about the extra traffic as it dumps onto Harris. I know everyone, or not everyone, most people in that area don't go on Harris. They actually head west, up Mackenzie and get onto the truck route. And the result of this would be drive more people down Mackenzie, out on 8th and onto Harris. I'm not worried about the traffic impacts in Harris. I'm worried specifically about the shoreline and riparian impacts on the 8th Street segment. So yeah, I think Harris could handle the extra traffic. At the far end of this diversion, the system can handle it. That's a traffic impact I think you were talking about. I'm referring to kind of the non-traffic impacts of traffic, if that makes some sense.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some of the correspondence that asks about things like light pollution and additional emissions that would be created from additional volumes on 8th Street. We don't have anything to quantify that. We have talked with our natural resources staff about that. They've looked at this issue. They're not concerned about the additional impacts. You're talking about a creek in an urban environment. All of the runoff there in terms of stormwater goes into the stormwater facility, which never existed prior to the city building that to capture 90 acres of untreated stormwater water quality or stormwater runoff. Light pollution, you've got, whether you have folks going on 8th Street or folks turning around in a semicircle turnaround at the end of Mackenzie, I'm not sure that there's a tremendous amount of difference there. I know it's been brought forward when we talked with our natural resources staff about that. They didn't really differentiate between the two, one being better than the other. Any development has some impact. Any additional traffic has some impact. 8th Street, you're talking about hundreds of cars, not thousands of cars. It's in the grand scheme of things, very light. Certainly more than what's there now, and I'm not minimizing the concerns that are being brought forward by the neighborhood. We're just trying to work within our existing development guidelines, our existing code, and the existing policies in our various documents to try to make something work here. And I think we believe what's before the council is the best solution, but as has already been said, certainly warrants additional conversation, and we're happy to to meet with folks. We're happy to have another work session with council if there's specific questions and try to answer them to everyone's satisfaction.
We have a motion before us to postpone this decision till the next meeting, so staff can, or neighbors can get questions answered and things. All those in favor, answer aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay. And that's the end of the committee.
Thanks.
Thank you, Terry. Terry, we'll take a brief break. We'll come back with our next committee.